The systematic erasure of palace women in Imperial China represents one of history's most calculated exercises in human dehumanization, a machine of oppression that operated for over 2 millennia with chilling efficiency. To understand the magnitude of this erasure, we must first confront the brutal reality of how these women entered the imperial system, beginning with children barely past their 13th birthday, who were torn from their families and subjected to a selection process designed not merely to choose servants, but to systematically destroy their sense of self before palace service even began. The recruitment process began each spring when imperial eunuchs descended upon villages across the empire like predators selecting prey. These were not random selections but calculated harvests, targeting girls from specific ethnic groups and social classes according to imperial decree. The timing was deliberate, coinciding with agricultural seasons when families were most vulnerable economically and least able to hide their daughters or flee to neighboring regions. Village headmen, themselves trapped within the imperial administrative system, were required to compile lists of eligible girls months in advance, creating detailed inventories that included physical descriptions, family backgrounds, and assessments of each girl's potential suitability for palace service. Han Chinese girls formed the largest group, but the system particularly prized women from conquered territories, viewing their subjugation as symbolic of imperial dominance. Manchu girls during the Qing dynasty held the highest status, while Mongol, Korean, and Vietnamese girls occupied middle tiers, and Han Chinese girls, despite their numbers, were often relegated to the lowest positions. This ethnic hierarchy was not accidental, but deliberately designed to fragment potential solidarity among the women, ensuring that even in their shared oppression, they remained divided by artificial distinctions of rank and origin. The psychological impact of this ranking system extended beyond the palace walls, creating resentment and competition between ethnic communities that served imperial interests by preventing unified resistance to the recruitment system itself. The initial selection focused on girls aged 13 to 16, an age chosen with calculated precision. These children were old enough to perform labor, but young enough to be completely malleable, their personalities not yet fully formed and therefore easier to reshape according to imperial needs. Palace officials had conducted extensive studies over generations to determine the optimal age for recruitment, documenting which age groups adapted most successfully to palace conditioning and which proved most resistant to the psychological transformation required for effective service. The results of these studies, preserved in secret imperial archives, revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that would not be matched by Western behavioral science for centuries. The eunuchs who conducted these selections were themselves victims of the system, castrated as children and raised within the palace structure, making them perfect instruments for perpetuating the cycle of abuse. They understood intimately how to identify the psychological markers that indicated a girl could be successfully broken and rebuilt as an imperial servant. These eunuchs had developed elaborate assessment techniques, observing how girls reacted to sudden loud noises, unexpected physical contact, and deliberate intimidation. They looked for specific combinations of intelligence and submissiveness, noting which girls showed creativity that could be channeled into useful skills, while avoiding those whose intelligence might lead to dangerous independent thinking. Families had no choice in this process. Imperial decree superseded all parental authority, and resistance meant death, not just for the girl, but potentially for the entire family. Parents were forced to present their daughters for inspection, knowing they might never see them again. The psychological trauma inflicted on families was itself part of the system's design, demonstrating imperial power, while ensuring that communities understood the absolute nature of imperial authority over their children's bodies and lives. Many families attempted to hide their daughters or marry them off early to avoid selection, but imperial agents had anticipated these strategies and developed countermeasures that made evasion virtually impossible. The economic impact on families was devastating and deliberately so. When a daughter was selected for palace service, families lost not only a beloved child, but also a crucial source of labor and future economic security. Daughters were expected to care for aging parents and contribute to household income through marriage alliances or skilled work. The imperial system provided no compensation for this loss, viewing the family's sacrifice as their patriotic duty to serve imperial glory. This economic devastation served as another form of control, ensuring that communities remained too impoverished and disrupted to organize effective resistance to future recruitment cycles. The girls selected in these village sweeps were immediately separated from their families and transported to regional collection centers, beginning their transformation from individuals with names, histories, and identities into numbered units in the imperial machine. During these journeys, which could last weeks, the girls were kept under constant surveillance by eunuch guards who began the process of psychological conditioning. They were forbidden to speak their real names, assigned numbers instead, and punished severely for any display of emotion or resistance. The transportation itself was designed as a form of psychological torture, with the girls packed into windowless wagons that prevented them from seeing their homeland disappearing behind them or gaining any sense of where they were being taken. Many girls attempted suicide during these transports, but the eunuchs were prepared for this, employing various methods to prevent self-harm while simultaneously using these attempts as teaching moments to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The guards carried special restraints designed to prevent hanging or other forms of self-inflicted death, and they had developed techniques for force-feeding girls who attempted to starve themselves. When suicide attempts occurred, the guards would gather all the girls to witness the punishment of the would-be suicide, creating elaborate displays of suffering that served as warnings while reinforcing the message that even death was not within their control. The psychological conditioning during transport involved systematic sleep deprivation, irregular feeding schedules, and constant verbal abuse designed to break down the girls' sense of personal identity. Guards would wake the girls at random intervals throughout the night, forcing them to recite their assigned numbers and perform degrading tasks. They were taught songs praising imperial glory while being forbidden to sing any melodies from their home regions. This musical reconditioning was particularly effective because songs and melodies are deeply connected to memory and cultural identity, making their suppression a powerful tool for psychological erasure. Upon arrival at the imperial capital, the girls faced the first major winnowing process. Out of thousands collected from across the empire, only a fraction would be selected for palace service. The remainder would be sold into other forms of servitude or, in many cases, simply disposed of as surplus inventory. This elimination process was deliberately brutal, designed to demonstrate to the survivors that they had no value beyond their utility to the imperial system. The rejected girls often faced fates worse than those who died during transport, sold to brothels, labor camps, or private households where they would endure different forms of exploitation without even the minimal protections that palace regulations provided. The examination process that determined a girl's fate was invasive beyond modern comprehension. Palace physicians, always male, conducted thorough physical examinations that violated every concept of privacy or dignity. Girls were stripped naked and examined for physical defects, scars, or any sign of previous illness. Their teeth were inspected like those of livestock, their hair examined for texture and color, their skin scrutinized for blemishes. The physicians paid particular attention to signs of sexual experience, as virginity was considered essential for most palace positions. Though the examinations themselves were conducted with such invasive thoroughness that they constituted sexual assault by any reasonable definition. These medical examinations extended far beyond basic physical assessment to include detailed measurements and documentation that would follow the girls throughout their palace careers. Physicians recorded precise body measurements, noting any asymmetries or unusual features that might affect the girls' suitability for specific types of service. They tested reflexes, examined eyesight and hearing, and assessed physical strength and endurance through a series of degrading physical trials. The girls were forced to demonstrate their ability to maintain uncomfortable positions for extended periods, testing their capacity to endure the physical demands of palace service without complaint. Beyond physical examination, the girls underwent psychological evaluation designed to assess their suitability for different types of service. Palace officials, trained in reading human nature through years of court intrigue, observed how each girl responded to humiliation, pain, and fear. Those who showed too much spirit were marked for the harshest treatment or elimination. Those who displayed the right combination of intelligence and submissiveness were earmarked for positions requiring more complex skills. Those who broke completely under the initial pressure were designated for the most menial labor, their shattered psyches making them ideal for tasks requiring absolute obedience without thought. The psychological evaluation process involved sophisticated techniques that revealed the depth of Imperial understanding of human behavior. Girls were subjected to unexpected kindness followed by sudden cruelty, testing their ability to adapt to unpredictable treatment. They were given impossible tasks and observed to see whether they would admit failure or attempt deception. They were placed in situations where they could betray fellow captives for small advantages, revealing their willingness to prioritize survival over solidarity. These tests were designed not just to assess the girls' current psychological state, but to predict how they would respond to years of palace conditioning. The month-long testing period that followed represented perhaps the most systematic program of psychological destruction ever implemented on such a scale. The girls were housed in dormitories under the supervision of senior palace women known as aunts, themselves victims of the same system who had survived long enough to become its enforcers. These aunts had internalized their oppression so completely that they took pride in their ability to break new arrivals, viewing their cruelty as professional competence rather than perpetuation of their own abuse. Many of these supervisory women had been selected for their roles precisely because they had demonstrated exceptional loyalty to the system that had destroyed their own lives, making them ideal instruments for destroying others. Each day of the testing period brought new humiliations designed to strip away the girls' remaining sense of individual identity. They were awakened before dawn and subjected to hours of physical training that pushed their bodies beyond endurance. Those who collapsed were beaten as examples to the others. They were taught to walk in the peculiar gliding style required in the palace, a movement so unnatural that it required complete reconstruction of their natural gait. This physical reprogramming served multiple purposes, making escape more difficult while creating a visible marker of their transformed status that would identify them as palace property even if they somehow managed to flee. The girls were forbidden to speak unless spoken to, and when they did speak, they were required to use a specific vocabulary that eliminated all references to their previous lives. They could not mention their families, their home villages, or their given names. Instead, they were taught a palace dialect filled with euphemisms and coded language that reinforced their new reality as imperial property. Violations of these speech codes resulted in immediate punishment, often involving public humiliation designed to reinforce the lesson for all observers. The linguistic transformation was particularly devastating because language shapes thought, and by controlling the girls' vocabulary, the system literally limited their ability to conceptualize resistance or remember their former identities. Meals during the testing period were deliberately inadequate, keeping the girls in a state of constant hunger that made them more compliant and easier to control. Food became a reward for proper behavior, creating a system of psychological conditioning that linked survival to absolute obedience. The girls learned to compete with each other for scraps, further fragmenting any potential solidarity while demonstrating their willingness to prioritize personal survival over collective resistance. The hunger was carefully calibrated to weaken the girls physically and mentally without rendering them unable to perform their assigned tasks, a balance that required sophisticated understanding of nutrition and human physiology. The ants who supervised this process were masters of psychological manipulation, having learned through their own suffering exactly which techniques most effectively destroyed a young person's sense of self. They employed a combination of unpredictable violence and occasional kindness that kept the girls in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether compliance would bring reward or punishment. This psychological uncertainty was more effective than constant brutality in creating the deep-seated fear and dependency that the system required. The ants had developed elaborate systems for tracking each girl's psychological state, noting which forms of abuse proved most effective for different personality types and adjusting their techniques accordingly. Sleep deprivation was another key component of the conditioning process. The girls were allowed only a few hours of rest each night, and even this sleep was frequently interrupted by surprise inspections or arbitrary punishments. This chronic exhaustion made clear thinking impossible, leaving the girls in a vulnerable state where they became increasingly dependent on their captors for basic guidance about how to survive each day. The sleep schedule was deliberately irregular, preventing the girls' bodies from adapting to any routine that might provide psychological stability or physical recovery. The testing period also included lessons in palace etiquette that were really exercises in self-erasure. The girls learned elaborate protocols for every aspect of behavior, from how to hold their hands when walking to the precise angle at which they should bow to different ranks of officials. These protocols were so complex and numerous that mastering them required complete mental focus, leaving no psychological space for thoughts of resistance or escape. The girls who succeeded in learning these protocols did so by surrendering their mental autonomy, allowing the palace system to occupy their consciousness completely. Religious and cultural practices from the girls' home communities were systematically suppressed during this period. Any display of traditional beliefs or customs resulted in severe punishment. The girls were forced to participate in imperial religious ceremonies that contradicted their family traditions, completing their separation from their previous identities. This spiritual violence was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the conditioning process, as it severed the girls' connection to the belief systems that might have provided psychological resistance to their oppression. Palace authorities understood that spiritual beliefs provided strength and hope, making their elimination essential for complete psychological control. The physical transformation required during the testing period extended beyond deportment to include alterations in appearance that marked the girls as imperial property. Their hair was cut and styled according to palace regulations, often requiring the removal of traditional ornaments or styles that connected them to their ethnic heritage. Their clothing was replaced with standardized palace garments that eliminated any expression of individual taste or cultural identity. Even their names were systematically erased, replaced with numbers or generic titles that reflected their assigned functions rather than their human identity. Medical procedures during this period often included interventions designed to ensure the girls' continued utility to the palace. Those designated for certain types of service underwent surgical procedures to prevent pregnancy, performed without anesthesia or proper medical care. Others received treatments designed to alter their physical appearance according to imperial preferences, including procedures that would be considered mutilation by contemporary standards. These medical interventions served both practical and psychological purposes, physically marking the girls as imperial property while demonstrating the absolute control the system exercised over their bodies. The psychological evaluation process continued throughout the testing period, with palace officials making detailed notes about each girl's responses to various stimuli. They tested pain tolerance, observing how quickly girls recovered from beatings, and whether they showed signs of developing the emotional numbness required for palace service. They evaluated intelligence, but not in ways that might threaten imperial authority. Instead, they sought the specific type of cunning required to navigate palace intrigue without developing independent judgment that might lead to resistance. Competition among the girls was actively encouraged during this period, with the ants creating artificial scarcities and conflicts that forced the girls to compete against each other for basic necessities. Those who showed willingness to betray their fellow captives for small advantages were noted as potential candidates for supervisory positions in the future. This system ensured that even among the victims, solidarity was impossible, as survival depended on demonstrating loyalty to the system rather than to other victims. The competition was carefully structured to reward behaviors that served imperial interests while punishing any display of mutual support or collective resistance. The girls who survived the testing period had been fundamentally transformed, their original personalities so thoroughly suppressed that they barely resembled the children who had been taken from their villages months earlier. They had learned to find safety in absolute compliance, to seek approval from their oppressors, and to view their previous lives as irrelevant dreams rather than stolen realities. This transformation was not accidental, but the result of sophisticated psychological techniques refined over centuries of imperial practice. The success of the conditioning process was measured not just by compliance, but by the complete internalization of imperial values, creating victims who genuinely believed their oppression was justified and necessary. Those who failed the testing period simply disappeared, their fate never officially recorded but understood by all survivors as a warning about the consequences of inadequate adaptation to palace life. The system's efficiency in disposing of unsuitable candidates was itself a form of psychological control, demonstrating to survivors that their continued existence depended entirely on their usefulness to imperial purposes. The disappearances were carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact, with failed candidates vanishing suddenly and completely, leaving no trace that might provide closure or understanding for the survivors. The successful candidates emerged from the testing period as hollow shells of their former selves, ready to begin their actual palace service. They had been stripped of everything that made them unique individuals and rebuilt as interchangeable components in the imperial machine. Their families would never see them again, and within a few years, the girls themselves would struggle to remember their original names or the faces of their parents. This erasure of memory was not a side effect of the system, but one of its primary objectives, ensuring that the women could never fully reconnect with their pre-palace identities even if escape became possible. The transition from testing to actual palace service marked the beginning of a new phase of oppression, one characterized by the daily grind of survival within a system designed to extract maximum utility from human beings while providing minimal conditions for their continued existence. The palace complex itself was a physical manifestation of the hierarchical system that governed every aspect of the women's lives, with different sections designated for different ranks of servants and elaborate protocols governing movement between areas. The architecture was deliberately designed to reinforce psychological control, with narrow corridors that prevented large gatherings, high walls that blocked views of the outside world, and maze-like layouts that made navigation impossible without intimate knowledge of the complex. Daily life in the palace began before dawn with the sound of bells that regulated every moment of the women's existence. They had no personal time, no private space, and no decisions to make about their own lives. Every action was prescribed by palace regulations that had been refined over centuries to maximize efficiency while minimizing any opportunity for independent thought or action. The women learned to move through their days like automatons, performing their assigned tasks with mechanical precision, while suppressing any remaining traces of individual personality. The bells themselves became instruments of psychological control, their constant presence serving as auditory reminders of the system's absolute authority over time and space. The hierarchy among palace women was deliberately complex, creating multiple levels of status that prevented unified resistance while encouraging competition and betrayal. At the bottom were the general servants who performed the most menial labor under constant supervision. Above them were specialized servants with particular skills, such as seamstresses, cooks, or cleaners, who enjoyed slightly better conditions in exchange for their expertise. Higher still were the personal servants of imperial family members, who wielded significant informal power, but remained completely dependent on their master's favor for their survival. At the apex of this hierarchy were the concubines and imperial wives, women who had achieved the highest possible status within the system, but at the cost of complete surrender of their autonomy. These women lived in luxury compared to the servants, but their lives were even more tightly controlled, as they represented valuable imperial property that required careful management. Their primary function was reproductive, and their success was measured entirely by their ability to produce male heirs for the imperial line. The irony of their position was profound, as their apparent elevation within the system actually represented the most complete form of objectification, reducing them to their biological functions while surrounding them with the trappings of privilege. The daily routine for most palace women involved endless repetition of menial tasks designed to serve imperial comfort while providing no personal satisfaction or growth. Servants might spend their entire lives cleaning the same rooms, preparing the same foods, or maintaining the same gardens, never allowed to develop skills that might provide independence or alternative sources of identity. This repetitive labor was itself a form of psychological control, keeping the women's minds occupied with immediate tasks while preventing the kind of reflection that might lead to resistance. The monotony was carefully designed to crush creativity and independent thinking, creating a state of mental numbness that made rebellion psychologically impossible. Surveillance within the palace was constant and multifaceted, involving not only official guards and supervisors, but also a network of informants among the women themselves. The system rewarded those who reported on their fellow servants, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made collective action virtually impossible. Women learned to guard their words and expressions carefully, knowing that any sign of discontent could be reported and result in severe punishment. The informant network was so extensive that women could never be certain who might be listening to their conversations or observing their behavior, creating a psychological prison more effective than physical walls. The punishment system within the palace was designed to be both brutal and unpredictable, keeping the women in a constant state of fear while demonstrating the absolute power of their imperial masters. Physical punishments ranged from beatings to more creative tortures, designed to inflict maximum pain while preserving the women's ability to continue working. Psychological punishments were equally severe, including public humiliation, isolation, and threats against any remaining family members outside the palace. The unpredictability of punishment was crucial to its effectiveness, as women could never be certain which actions might trigger severe consequences, creating a state of constant anxiety that prevented any form of organized resistance. Food within the palace was strictly rationed according to rank, with the lowest servants receiving barely enough nutrition to sustain life, while higher-ranking women enjoyed increasingly elaborate meals. This system of nutritional hierarchy served multiple purposes, providing incentives for advancement within the system while keeping the majority of women in a weakened state that made resistance more difficult. Malnutrition was a constant companion for most palace women, affecting their physical health, mental clarity, and emotional stability. The chronic hunger created a psychological state where immediate survival needs overwhelmed any capacity for long-term planning or resistance. Medical care within the palace was similarly stratified, with imperial family members receiving the best available treatment while servants were often left to suffer through illness and injury without assistance. Palace physicians viewed the servants as expendable resources rather than human beings deserving of care, treating them only when their conditions threatened to interfere with their work performance. Many women died from treatable conditions, simply because their lives were not considered valuable enough to warrant the expense of proper medical attention. This medical neglect served as another form of control, demonstrating the women's complete dependence on imperial benevolence for their most basic needs. The psychological coping mechanisms that palace women developed to survive their circumstances were both ingenious and tragic, representing human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization, while simultaneously demonstrating the effectiveness of the imperial system in breaking human spirits. Some women retreated into elaborate fantasy lives, creating rich internal worlds that provided escape from their daily reality. Others developed forms of dissociation that allowed them to perform their duties while psychologically distancing themselves from their experiences. These coping mechanisms, while necessary for psychological survival, also served the system's interests by preventing the kind of clear-eyed assessment of their situation that might lead to resistance. Religious and spiritual practices provided another avenue for psychological survival, though these had to be carefully hidden from palace authorities who viewed any form of independent belief as potentially subversive. Women developed secret rituals and shared coded prayers that maintained connections to their cultural heritage while providing comfort in their darkest moments. These underground spiritual networks represented some of the few genuine communities that developed among palace women, though they remained fragile and constantly threatened by the palace surveillance system. The spiritual practices had to be so carefully concealed that they often became mere fragments of their original forms, further contributing to the women's cultural erasure. The complete erasure of these women's stories from official historical records was not accidental, but represented a deliberate policy designed to prevent their experiences from serving as inspiration for future resistance or as evidence of imperial cruelty. Palace historians, all male and completely dependent on imperial favor for their positions, wrote accounts that either ignored the women entirely or portrayed them as willing participants in imperial glory rather than victims of systematic oppression. This historical manipulation extended to the destruction of any documents that might preserve the women's own voices or perspectives on their experiences. This historical erasure extended beyond simple omission to active falsification, with palace records describing the women's service in language that suggested privilege rather than slavery, opportunity rather than exploitation. The few women who achieved high status within the system were presented as examples of imperial benevolence. Their success stories used to justify the entire system, while conveniently omitting the thousands who died in obscurity after lives of unrelenting suffering. These sanitized narratives became the foundation for later historical accounts that portrayed the palace system as a civilizing institution rather than a machine of human exploitation. The systematic destruction of personal documents, letters, and any other evidence of the women's individual experiences ensured that their voices would be lost to history. Palace authorities regularly searched the women's quarters for any written materials that might preserve their stories, destroying anything that revealed their true thoughts or feelings about their circumstances. This documentary genocide was as thorough as the physical and psychological oppression, ensuring that the women would be remembered only as imperial property rather than as human beings with their own hopes, dreams, and suffering. The few accounts that survived were heavily censored and edited to conform to imperial propaganda, presenting sanitized versions of palace life that bore little resemblance to the brutal reality experienced by the women themselves. These sanitized accounts became the basis for later historical narratives that portrayed Imperial China as a civilization of refined culture and benevolent authority, completely obscuring the systematic human rights violations that sustained imperial power. The censorship was so thorough that even scholars with access to imperial archives would find little evidence of the true nature of the palace system. The legacy of this systematic erasure continues to influence how we understand Chinese history today, with the experiences of palace women remaining largely invisible in mainstream historical narratives. Their stories represent not just individual tragedies, but a massive crime against humanity that was sustained for over 2,000 years through the deliberate suppression of evidence and the systematic destruction of memory. The historical invisibility of these women has allowed romanticized portrayals of Imperial China to persist, obscuring one of history's most sustained exercises in human exploitation. Understanding the true scope of this oppression requires us to recognize that the palace women were not passive victims, but human beings who found ways to resist, survive, and maintain their humanity despite systematic efforts to destroy their sense of self. Their erasure from history represents not just the loss of individual stories, but the suppression of evidence about one of history's most sustained exercises in human exploitation, a system that transformed the systematic abuse of women into a cornerstone of imperial power and cultural prestige. The scale of this erasure represents perhaps the most successful campaign of historical denial in human history, one that continues to shape our understanding of the past while obscuring lessons that remain relevant to contemporary struggles for human dignity and freedom.